Alrighty, so it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tim Althoff. He is a associate professor in the Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. Tim's research seeks to better understand and empower people through data and computation, and his AI research has directly improved mental health services utilized by over 10 million people and informed federal policy. Tim holds a PhD degree from the Computer Science Department at Stanford University, and his work has received various awards, including WWW, ICWSM, ACL, UBIComp, and IMIA Best Paper Awards, and the SIG KDD Dissertation Award in 2019, and an NSF Career Award. Tim's research has been covered internationally by news outlets including the BBC, CNN, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And today he will be talking about his work using language models as temporary training wheels to improve mental health. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Althoff. Thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the exceedingly kind introduction and for the invitation. Let me share some slides of my own. Is that looking fine?
Yep, looks great.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining. Very excited you're all here. I've learned that in the sitting there's a great history of good discussions afterwards, and I very much look forward to that. So I decided that I wanted to talk to you all about some of our recent work around human AI collaboration and language models, specifically in mental health. And I want to talk about how we can use language models, this latest craze in AI, similar to training wheels, like on a bike, to improve mental health care. And one reason we're talking about language models today is that there have been tremendous advances in language models and AI more broadly over the past few years. And I want to make sure that we have some common ground to start with. So I'll start with what language models are. You might have heard of language models like Gemini or ChatGPT. In many ways, they've become more household names than similar technology ever was in the past. And in some sense, these are machines that listen to you, they can respond to you, they can translate between languages, they can solve problems, they can learn, they can retrieve information, they can seemingly express emotions, all of which kind of used to be science fiction until fairly recently. As of course, our beloved C3PO was famously fluent in over 6 million forms of communication. So what exactly is a language model? A language model is a computer program designed to understand and generate human-like text. It learns patterns and structures from very large amounts of written language, and that enables it to predict and generate coherent or contextually relevant sentences. In fact, I didn't come up with this explanation just to illustrate the point. This explanation was written by a language model. It was automatically generated, and we'll see many more examples like that throughout the talk. Now, how does that work? There's actually a very simple idea at the core of it, which is to predict the next word. So let's say we have a sentence here at the bottom, how are blank doing today? You all have great ideas what could fit in here. How are you doing today? How are they doing today? And what the models really do is they predict the probability distribution over the most likely words that could be filled in here. And it turned out that this very simple idea actually was incredibly powerful. If you have a ton of data and a ton of computational resources, if you do this a billion, more often even a trillion times, it turns out to do this really well, you need to learn a lot about language. And you don't need specifically annotated data. You just take all the text you can get. And that's really what most companies building these models have done. With kind of these basics on language models. Let's talk about training wheels, kind of a metaphor I want to use in this talk. And if we were in person and this was a little bit less awkward, I would do a poll with you all. I'll save us that on Zoom, though I still hope that you can kind of relate to this picture. I'm assuming that many of us on the call here learned to ride a bike, and that maybe some of us learned to do so by using training wheels, or maybe you use them for your own children, teaching them how to ride a bike. At the same time, I would also venture a guess that very few of us are still using these training wheels today. Still, for a brief period, these training wheels really helped us learn. They made biking a bit easier. It helped us focus on one thing at a time. It also made it safer to practice how to ride a bike, at least initially for many of us. Now, so sometimes we make things additionally. Up, screen sharing has stopped. I don't know whether this. Just 1 second. Talk about emotional regulation in a second. So please let me know if that's not showing up, but I tried resharing this.
We're good. Yeah, looks good.
Thank you. We sometimes make things easier in order to learn something, and we do that very intentionally, like with these training wheels. But we actually also sometimes makes things harder if we really want to learn something. For instance, in this picture here, we see a runner who's running with a weighted vest at altitude, presumably to help them train for a competition, maybe near sea level. So it can even be productive and desirable to make things harder on us. And we tend to want to make things harder for us only if we think that a certain skill or experience is actually really valuable to us. So next, I want to share a few favorites of skills that seem rather important to me. And those are skills that will help improve our mental health, our relationships, and I wouldn't be opposed to having them contribute to help save our democracy as well. And the first example I want to bring up is empathy. That's the ability to understand or share the emotions and experiences of others. Another one is emotional regulation, the ability to manage and express emotions appropriately. Another one is conflict resolution, the ability to address disagreements constructively. Conflict, of course, is normal, but it's very helpful to have healthy ways of dealing with said conflict. And the last example I want to share is cognitive flexibility, maybe sometimes called reappraisal, which is being open to new information, being willing to change one's mind in the face of new evidence, being able to challenge your existing views and perspectives. So now I wonder, are we getting better at these skills? I think it would be helpful, but I'm not so sure. At the same time, I think it's quite challenging to learn and exercise these skills. It's challenging. All of these skills are somewhat uncomfortable, perhaps even painful. So I don't know, why not outsource them to an AI and language model? We're talking about outsourcing so many things. If it's painful, why not let somebody else do it? And I hope that came at least with a slight discomfort across the room. I do have some concerns around this of my own. In many ways, I worry about the kind of all too convenient, all too agreeable AI assistant that we're already building for all kinds of applications. But especially in these scenarios where we're talking about skills where we find ourselves commonly in scenarios where we really need that skill, where you can't necessarily outsource something to a language model, say on your phone. We need those skills personally and for direct personal and societal benefit. So those are scenarios where we can't have training wheels anymore, where we may not be able to have AI directly at our fingertips. And kind of this is the setting that I want to talk about today. And just to give an example, if maybe some of you have not seen shocking examples of how wonderfully agreeable all these tools are, because they could not possibly disagree with us on something. I tried something like we're giving a talk on a Tuesday. I randomly kind of told ChatGPT, hey, I think Tuesdays are just the worst day of the week. Don't you agree? And shockingly, the model agrees. You can try this for any other day. They are all the worst. Whatever you're saying is right. So I worry that this is getting a bit too convenient, that these models are often trying to be helpful to even pathological degrees, that they might reinforce existing beliefs or biases without challenging them, potentially withhold alternate viewpoints. And when we really need certain skills, we might not be ready. So let's say we do want to learn important skills like the ones I introduced earlier. How would we teach them? Well, thankfully, we have a lot to build on here from education and learning theory. I think there's three things that really stand out to me about how to use AI in meaningful ways to help teach people skills, which is to start with supportive scaffolding, to kind of use tools and structures provided to grasp basics, to then provide deliberate practice, maybe practicing specific areas where we need improvement, and practicing intentionally and purposefully. And finally, adding constructive feedback, whether that's during or after a practice session, kind of seeking and reflecting on feedback, and then using that to improve our performance. And it's often been shown that you can use language to do all that. Teachers do that every day. And I kind of, behind all the research that I want to show you today, is this hypothesis that language models can also provide the scaffolding and this practice and this feedback, creating new opportunities for learning that, especially in the realm of mental health, we're very excited about. And so I want to illustrate this hypothesis by telling you essentially about two recent research projects I was involved in. In each project, we will teach important skills through AI-supported scaffolding and practice and feedback. But then we want to measure performance without training wheels. I'm using this training wheels metaphor precisely because they're designed to come off in the end. So I hope to kind of bring our conversation to designing human AI interactions that really empower users that transition from merely being reliant on AI to be able to do something to real mastery of these skills, to ensure that AI really supports, that this AI support acts as a stepping stone rather than as a crutch ultimately. So this also really means that we might be designing AI support with kind of planned obsolescence in mind. And I really believe that this could help us lead to more effective and sustained learning outcomes. So what I want to do next is I will tell you about two projects, and this is the first one. And first, we'll dive into how we can use AI support to build self-guided tools that teach you critical mental health skills. Specifically here, we will focus on how we can reframe negative thoughts. And I love starting with this photograph here that was part of an amazing art campaign. This is Nathaniel, and Nathaniel consented to all of this. Nathaniel was somebody that chose to share his personal story in this art and mental health campaign called Let's Talk. And as you can see here, the artist powerfully expresses his inner reality as lettering on his face. And I'm showing you this because it illustrates really well that we all have negative thoughts. We actually express them through language, even if we don't make it as explicit as the artists here. This is why I believe this kind of advent and advances in language models can really lead to meaningful improvements in the mental health world, because so much about our mental health, about our psychology, is actually expressed in language. So it's common to experience negative thoughts. Nathaniel isn't the only one, and the following thing happens to me more often than I like to admit. And hopefully, at least the researchers in the room can relate, and I'm not alone in that myself. Let's say I submit a paper, it gets rejected, and I have a thought like, I'll never succeed as a researcher. Like, that can be quite painful. It's something I quite enjoy. And so that's a quite kind of identity relevant thought to me. And these thoughts matter because they also relate to our feelings and our behaviors. Thoughts like that might come with self-doubt or frustration. It might come with behaviors that are really not aligned in my best interests in the end. I might procrastinate instead of more constructively responding to this situation. But it's just really difficult to deal with these thoughts. They're often entrenched and automatic and emotionally triggering. Thankfully, there's proven therapeutic techniques to kind of overcome these negative thought patterns, and that's often called cognitive reframing or cognitive restructuring, and the core of cognitive behavioral therapy. And the key idea here is to challenge your thought with a more balanced, reframed thought. So for instance, instead of "I'll never succeed as a researcher," we might say, well, it's normal to feel disappointed when a paper gets rejected, and can use this experience to learn and grow. And again, this is important because it might relate to different feelings and behaviors. I might feel better about myself. I might feel more optimistic. Maybe instead of procrastinating, I'm seeking feedback from my friends and colleagues, as I'm doing right now. And as I mentioned before, this kind of process is really central to one of the most popular and most evidence-based forms of therapy today, cognitive behavioral therapy. But it turns out that this process, as helpful as it is, it's actually quite difficult. It's difficult to come up with these kind of helpful reframings, especially for people to do that on their own in the moment. And in many ways, the current status quo is to do this on a piece of paper. Here you see kind of a worksheet of the kind that maybe a therapist might share with you if you're lucky enough to work with one. And in many ways, all you get is this kind of last column here, pretty much an empty text box, but this paper doesn't help you how to do this task. It doesn't give you any feedback. It's a very difficult task, and all you're facing is this empty text box. So that's where we hypothesized that there could actually be value added through kind of novel AI technology. As I mentioned before, it's really difficult for people to do this, especially in the moment. This is exactly the type of skill that a professional therapist could help you learn and practice, and that's amazing. The sad part of our reality is that most people do not have access to professional therapists, even when they need it, even when they seek the support for a variety of reasons. So this led a mental health organization, a nonprofit called Mental Health America, and our research team to hypothesize that, well, maybe we can use some form of human AI collaboration to provide scaffolding that makes this process easier to engage with, that would help us make these type of tools much more accessible, that more people that can have a value from these type of tools and skills, that they gain access to it. And I want to show you a demo of how this works. And again, this was co-developed with this amazing Mental Health America organization. And for anybody who has kind of done this process before or seen these type of worksheets, this will look very familiar. And I'll point out when kind of AI comes in meaningful ways here. So let's start with a thought. I'll put in my own painful researcher thought again, but here at the bottom, you can also see some of the most popular thoughts that people fill into this page. It's fairly heavy stuff, from "no one cares about me" to "I'm worthless" to "I'm a failure," "I'm scared something bad will happen to the people I love," and so on. I'm only willing to admit to "I will never achieve success as a researcher," so we'll go with that one. And next, we'll ask about a situation in which this thought came up. And this is helpful to learn a little bit more about the context of the person that's using the system. In my case, I submitted a paper and I got rejected again. Turns out for AI to be truly useful to you, it needs to know a minimum amount about you. And this is one way how we can kind of elicit that, even though it's kind of asking one more question, asking for one more click. And kind of in this next step is when AI comes in the first place. So we use the language of thinking traps, which psychologists might call cognitive distortions. These are these patterns of, for instance, all or nothing thinking or catastrophizing. And here, instead of, for instance, requiring people to, I don't know, read 50 pages in a book about all the different thinking traps and how to identify them and how to differentiate them and how to challenge them, this is something that AI can help with. So we know exactly what's going on in my thought right now. We leave kind of some of the other classes or categories for later. And here kind of machine algorithms can recognize that what's going on in my thoughts is probably overgeneralizing or fortune telling or all or nothing thinking, all of which fit this situation pretty well. And I can then select one to specifically challenge and move forward. And now the most exciting part comes in, whereas now we get to challenge and reframe this thinking. And this is the hardest part for people. This is where people would commonly drop out in kind of digital mental health tools like this. And one thing we can do with language models today is that we can actually generate some starting points. Again, these are not meant to do your thinking for you. That's actually the active ingredient in this intervention. But we can generate some starting points, and we actually generate 3 of them in the hope that everybody has at least one that they can relate to relatively well and then make their own. This is the part that's really hard for people to do on their own. This is the part where if you are lucky to have access to a therapist, they might help you with if you're struggling with this. And this is something that we can do with these models. And kind of recall that the contrast really is kind of working with a piece of paper or a PDF that is largely an empty text box that is not able to give you this kind of feedback. So just to read out some of the generated responses here. One might be, it's normal to feel disappointed when something doesn't go as planned. I can use this experience to learn and grow. I'm sure I'll have more success in the future. Or rejection is a part of the process. I'll take the feedback I received and I'll use it to improve my paper and submit it again. And again, these are just starting points, but these are really important starting points. Now, in collaboration with mental health experts, clinical psychologists, patient advocates, after systematic ethics and safety considerations, after ensuring high quality and safety, we actually did deploy this model on this Mental Health America website. And it's still available to you all today. I'll have the QR code at the end if anybody wants to try this out later. And kind of by working with this amazing Mental Health America organization, we've had the opportunity to do dozens and dozens of randomized trials to really understand how well these things are working, how to design them. And across all these studies, we've had over 160,000 people use this tool to date. Next, I'll share a few of the things we've been able to learn by publicly deploying and evaluating this type of technology. A particularly early but exciting and promising result was that engagement rates seemed rather promising initially. For those of you that have seen cognitive restructuring before, you're well familiar. This is a very standard, very common type of skill in this type of context. So actually, even before our tool, Mental Health America already did have a tool on their website, just a digitized version of how people can go through this process. But what we did find is there were only about 3% of people that started the tool would actually successfully finish this process. As I mentioned before, this is actually quite difficult to do, especially in the moment when you're dealing with something. And we saw that our tool, even though there's kind of also some differences in the design, we immediately saw 8x, kind of 800% higher engagement rates that are still far from perfect, but encouraging that by providing the right scaffolding to people, that we really can make these challenging processes and kind of skill building tools more accessible. And what's really standing out to me is how cheap this is. We never optimized any of that for cost. Still, it's actually cheaper to deliver this kind of tool to somebody than to print even a single worksheet. And of course, if a human being prints that worksheet and hands it to this worksheet just became a whole lot more expensive. It only costs us a few cents at most for somebody to use a tool like this. But it's not only more engaging, it actually turns out to work better and achieve better outcomes in a variety of different ways. And everything I'm going to show you next is from the variety of randomized trials that we were able to run. So we did find in randomized trials that compared to a pixel by pixel identical version of the tool without the AI support, that people actually rate the reframes themselves as more helpful. They also share that they find they're better able to learn this type of skill through this AI support. We find that people tend to feel better, even though kind of using this tool maybe takes somebody, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 minutes. And feeling better actually isn't the primary goal here. The goal is to teach this skill of identifying challenging negative thought. But of course, we're happy to see that this kind of primarily cognitive intervention has some positive emotional outcomes as well. And what's perhaps from a theoretical perspective particularly interesting is through this large-scale deployment, we were able to learn a lot about the psychology and about how to do reframing in particularly effective ways, in ways we really couldn't have studied prior to kind of machines being involved in this process. So of course, a key question is, what makes a reframe particularly effective for somebody? And if you consult the literature, you would find that reframes should be relatable to the individual. They should be helpful in overcoming this negative thought. And they should be memorable to be kind of accessible the next time a similar thought arises. If this is a painful thought to you, chances are a similar thought has been in your mind before and it will arise again. So it's really helpful to kind of remember how to challenge it the next time when the next time comes around. So it's supposed to be relatable and helpful and memorable. The challenge is we don't really know what that means. How do you actually make a reframe that is relatable and helpful and memorable? But we could find that out kind of through the following work that we did. We first started by hypothesizing together with clinical experts what it might mean to make things, for instance, more helpful. And we came up with a framework of different linguistic attributes that we can measure and control precisely to really kind of in randomized control trials figure out really what makes an optimal reframe for somebody. And we had a hypothesis is like, well, maybe it would be good if it's rational, so it's not making assumption. Maybe you want to make something more positive. Maybe it should be more empathic or actionable or specific or readable. But a priori, right, like these are just the best guesses we could make. And here's what we found. Remember that I earlier mentioned we always show you 3 different candidates for each reframe. Then we can look at which one do you actually prefer, which one is the one you choose to kind of continue working with. And this is what these results here are showing. So for instance, we saw that people clearly preferred more specific reframes and more empathic reframes. They actually didn't like things that were overly positive. This tends to be not at all a shock to clinicians or psychologists, but is helpful for computer scientists to understand what's going on. And finally, in terms of the complexity of the language or the readability, there was this happy medium that people preferred in terms of how complex the sentences and the wording and so on was. And what did actually lead to better outcomes in terms of making it relatable and helpful and memorable? Well, making things more rational made it more relatable. And that makes surface level sense where what we mean here by rational is we teach machines to recognize when they're making assumptions. And something is more rational if it makes fewer assumptions. And it turns out if you make fewer assumptions, it's easier to create something that's not unrelatable to somebody. Actually addressing somebody's thinking trap and making it actionable and specific helped make it more helpful as measured by randomized trials again. And finally, to make it more memorable, the same kind of attributes of making it actionable and specific were the same ones that helped there. All right. Now, just because it works on average doesn't mean it works for everyone. And from an ethics principle of equity, we wanted to really understand that. It was important to us that this works for as many people as possible. So we analyzed this tool across many, many demographics. And I realized that these are all way too small numbers. All I want to use this for is to show you that there's more red at the top of this table than elsewhere. And really what we found was that if there's a group that has worse outcomes compared to others, and consistently so, it really was teenagers. Teenagers between like 13 and 17 years old categorically had worse outcome. And we tried to figure out what's going on there. And after some kind of looking around and hypothesizing, one thing we found, and maybe you can relate to that perhaps with your I don't know, own children, it turns out that younger folks use simpler language. They use shorter sentences and shorter words, so a lower reading complexity. And on average, this seems to be increasing just with age over time. So we made the not really too far-fetched hypothesis that what if we kind of use this insight in our reframes that we generate as well and make this language a bit simpler, perhaps more casual to understand. So we keep everything identical, but then we ask another language in the model in the end, hey, can you take this reframe and make it easy to understand, for instance, at the level of a 5th grader? And what we did find, again, in a randomized trial, is that it led to improvements in how relatable kind of 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds found this to be, or how helpful they found these reframes to be without actually decreasing any other outcomes. So this doesn't solve everything, but it's, I think, an important example to understand how we can understand who this doesn't work for, come up with concrete hypotheses for why this might be, and then make targeted improvements to really ensure that these tools that are meant to improve access really improve access for the largest population that we can support in this way. Now, kind of after these promising RCT results on large populations in the wild or in Lyme, we also invested in a classic pre-registered clinical trial and again found some encouraging results. We found that people, again, compared to pixel by pixel identical versions without AI support, find the reframes more effective. And we saw that people would actually use this AI tool more often than the identical tool without AI support. And we hypothesized that when you have a better first experience with these kind of very challenging kind of skill building tools, that you're more likely to kind of have a better time and be willing to engage in that activity going forward if your first experience is a little bit better. And to bring this back to this idea of training wheels and training wheels off, here's another way to look at these results. And here we ask very specifically whether people make use of this cognitive reframing skill outside of this tool, actually kind of in their own lives, day to day. Are you better able to identify when you have negative thoughts? Are you better able to challenge them? That's something that other researchers have developed validated scales for. And just to kind of emphasize this again, we ask about this experience outside of this tool to really evaluate the no training wheels situation. So people would answer questions like, well, I can catch myself thinking negatively, I can recognize this negative bias, and I can reevaluate the situation. And what we find is that over kind of this clinical trial where we taught people this skill for the first 4 weeks, and then we had an 8-week follow-up, we saw that the skill actually kept increasing until week 3, and then kept on the same level, including after not interacting with this tool for at least 4 weeks at week 8. So, but like, this doesn't mean everything, but it does mean that we can teach these type of skills, for instance, over a period of 3 weeks, and we can ensure that kind of learning outcomes are still there after 8 weeks and even after we take the training wheels away. All right. Now I'm going to tell you about project number 2, and this will involve the skill of conflict resolutions. And we kind of think about how we can help people have difficult conversations. And again, here we will add deliberate practice and constructive feedback enabled by AI models, and then we'll evaluate whether that's worth anything. So just to motivate this, I'm sure you're not surprised that many important conversations in life are very difficult to have. There's could be 1,000 examples, but just to name a few, maybe you're discussing healthcare options with an aging parent. Maybe you're negotiating a salary increase with the manager. Maybe you're confronting a good friend that borrowed some money some time ago that is maybe time to be returned. These conversations can be scary at times, but they're often important to us in our relationships, but they're also easily avoided. Why are they difficult? These conversations can be difficult for multiple reasons. One is that many of us have never been trained in particularly structured ways how to have these conversations in particularly effective ways. How do you even start these conversations? When and how do you negotiate? How do you clearly express your needs in a relationship? And even if you're in principle able to do these type of things, emotions can still get into the way. Maybe you're worried about the outcome of these conversations, or maybe you're not able to kind of express the skills you do have in principle when kind of emotions are on the line. How kind of learning and practice in this space currently looks like is that some select few individuals have experts to have access to experts, and they might kind of do in-person training or role play, maybe simulate difficult conversation and get some kind of real-time feedback. Most people on the planet do not have access to this type of training. On the other hand, Maybe you go online, maybe ask your favorite language model, but what you get is static resources, maybe some worksheets, maybe lists of conversational strategies, and so on. And as before, we often find that the in-person training that adds kind of simulation and feedback and deliberate practice and so on can be effective, but it's not accessible to most. On the other hand, the things that are accessible are often limited in their effectiveness, for instance, because they lack the practice or the constructive feedback. That again led us to build a system, a learning tool that's hopefully both accessible and effective that we called Imbue, which was this interactive training system, again, backed by language models that does multiple things. It simulates the difficult conversations that you dread having, and it also provides just-in-time feedback to both support kind of a learning of the conversational kind of strategy and skills, as well as emotion regulation behaviors. I'm sure everybody has their own favorite examples. I'll venture a guess that computer scientists aren't necessarily always the experts in conflict resolutions. So thankfully, we get to collaborate with amazing psychologists. And turns out there's many well-established frameworks on how we can teach skills like this. And one popular one that we embraced in kind of operationalized in this work is called the Dear Man framework that comes from dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. Very widely used framework, especially at the UW. And this happens to be a framework that captures both these kind of conversational strategies as well as this emotional regulation part. The Dear Man is an acronym, but the name fails to suggest that this is a gender-neutral framework. And the acronym stands for specific skills you're meant to express, like describing the facts of a situation without judgment, or expressing your emotions using I statements, and so on. And again, I'll show you a demo. I apologize. I'm sure this is hard to read on most screens. This is something that was not meant for mobile devices. But I only want to use this to give you a broad understanding of what this process works, and I'll read out the key pieces. So you might dread a situation, and in this case, we'll look at a situation where my dad has difficulty remembering his medication. I'm considering to hire a nurse to take care of him. He disagrees, he thinks he doesn't need help, and maybe I want to try and convince my dad to accept this help and allow me to hire an assistant for him. You might not know kind of how to get started at all, so we can kind of first ask, like, what's a good thing to even do right now? And here the system will kind of within this Dear Man framework share, maybe starting to describe the facts of this situation is a good point to start. We can then select what we want to do, and we don't need to do what the machine kind of told us initially, but in this case, we'll do exactly that. And it's probably a good idea, given that just to begin this situation, to start by this kind of expressing this describe skill. And then we ask people to actually write out a first message or response. So in this case, we're saying, you kept forgetting to take your meds. It's so bad for your health. And then we can get some feedback on this response that will show up here in a second once I get my animations right. So here within a few seconds, we can get some feedback based on this response that I'll paraphrase, kind of advise us to be more objective and maybe not add a statement like, oh, it's so bad for your health. And then we get to kind of try to improve. We get to rewrite our message, and then we can actually simulate a conversation. In this case, the conversation I dread having with my own dad. So after I kind of edit the response and send that off, here on the right-hand side, we have kind of this chat window going, and we can also simulate what my dad thinks of all of this. So in the system, there's really two key things going on. On the one hand, we have a simulation of a participant-provided communication scenario. So here we really allow people to show up with whatever scenario is on their mind, whatever it's hard for them, whatever they're avoiding. We kind of allow them to describe that situation and then simulate it. In this case, we're simulating a dad that's maybe slightly stubborn, appreciates the concern, but is pretty sure that they can take care of themselves just fine. On the other hand, we have this ideally expert-like, and I'll substantiate that with evidence in a second, just-in-time feedback. And we give two different types of feedback. We help you when you're not sure what to even do next, kind of what kind of skill, what type of conversation strategy makes sense next. And then when you try to do so, we can give you feedback on how you did that. So for instance, you constantly forget to take your meds. It's like, well, how often is constantly? Well, like that can come across judgmental. Let's kind of stick to the facts. And that might be one thing we can improve here. So to build the system, we first had to collect a bunch of data, and we wanted to collect lots of example situations that real people might struggle with in their own lives. And we also needed kind of expert level feedback where we worked with specialists at the UW, clinical experts that use this tool with their clients regularly. And we had them then annotate conversations and how people are having these conversations in terms of how they would help their own clients improve on these skills. As kind of some glossing over some technical details, but I'm very happy to discuss those in the discussion afterwards. First, I want to tell you how well this worked. And to be honest, I was quite surprised. Well, we did find, and I'm especially looking here at this first column. Here we are evaluating how often the feedback that a machine gives is essentially the same as that from an expert, as rated by kind of a third party. This is something that even very good language models, kind of broadly leading language models like GPT-4, did a really poor job at. Only 6% of the time, they kind of matched what the expert was suggesting. But kind of by adding different bells and whistles, we could actually get that number up to over 80%. It also turned out that the machine-given feedback was actually the most specific and most actionable, we learned as well. Kind of this initial evaluation only means that we can give feedback at a decent level of quality, which we kind of operationalize. How often would you say about the same thing as an expert would have said in this situation? It doesn't yet really say whether people actually learn this type of skill, which of course was the motivation here. And that's the last thing I'll show you today in this project. So here we did another randomized trial, and we randomized all participants to two conditions. Either you were randomized to just a simulation or a simulation and feedback component. We worked with about 80, 90 people. We asked everybody to share two kind of actual difficult communication scenarios that they're facing. And we kind of worked with those that kind of provided particularly challenging situations that were rated 7, 8, or 9 on a 9-point Likert scale. And then here's how the study works. And I'll build this up step by step because it was a bit more complex, but in helpful ways for science. So as I mentioned, each participant would give us two situations, both difficult, but whichever one is the slightly easier one, we call situation 1, and the other one is situation 2. We then ask a few questions, for instance, like how worried they are about having this conversation, how much they're avoiding it, things like that. And then before we do any kind of AI training, we actually evaluate them on skill use. So we kind of properly define the task. We do this with the typical worksheets that you might get, for instance, in therapy in this type of context. But then we want to see kind of how good are you at this before any kind of skill building tools. Now our training rules come. Now we actually, here's where the randomization is important. You either get simulation and feedback or simulation only, and you use this first situation to practice a conversation and get feedback. Then we'll take the training wheels off and we'll see, well, on this kind of exact same situation, let's have a new instance of this conversation. How good are you at that? And then we kind of take the training wheels off, but now we take this kind of hold out second situation to see how good are you at that? Does this actually generalize to a new situation if we kind of practice this for, say, 15, 20 minutes? And we're going to evaluate ourselves in terms of three things. One, do we see an improvement in terms of skill mastery? And here we use algorithms that we developed and validated in terms of how well you're expressing these skills. We're interested in emotion reduction, as well as pieces of self-efficacy. How confident are you actually now after this training to have this type of conversation? So let's jump into those results. So here, again, these are randomized trials, and S is simulation only, and S plus S, F is simulation and feedback. And what we see is that in terms of actual skill mastery, you don't actually get better just through simulation. It requires the feedback to actually get better. And we saw those improvements when there was feedback for both the kind of conversational skills as well as the state of mind or emotional regulation skills. And they improved by 16 to 25% in that group that did have access to feedback. Next, we were interested in about the emotional picture. How angry are you about this? How fearful are you about having this conversation? How sad does this make you? And interestingly, here we saw improvements even only with some stimulation, even just putting yourselves in those shoes about these conversations you dread to have. There's some improvements even just going through a simulation without feedback. However, we also saw that there are significantly higher differences when there was not only the simulation, but also the feedback. About a 41% reduction in how fearful I am about kind of having this conversation. And for some emotional outcomes like anger, the simulation alone didn't seem to do much by itself, and it took that additional feedback to see some significant differences. And finally, we want to evaluate self-efficacy. So here we're interested in like how confident, how worried are you, how hopeful are you about having this conversation, how motivated are you to have this conversation. And here, again, we find that simulation only leads to some positive outcomes. For instance, improving your confidence by 17%, or your decreasing your worry by 27%. But again, we see much better outcomes when you also add this feedback on top, like being even more confident or being more hopeful and more motivated. So let me just summarize that. The second project I shared with you is about this InView system that tries to provide scaffolding, deliberate practice, and constructive feedback. Over 80% of the time, we can essentially give this feedback at the same quality that kind of a DBT expert would do. Again, somebody that few, if any, have access to. It wasn't a given, but we actually found that a single session can demonstrably improve skills and emotions. It takes about 10-15 minutes to kind of go through one of these conversations. But we also found that to actually get better at the skills in terms of these conversational strategies, that really required both simulation and feedback. While for kind of emotional outcomes, it was enough to already just to have this simulation piece. And before I close, and I'm super excited for some discussion with everybody here, I usually spend a much larger part of my talk on ethics than I did today, and I decided to do so to really show you the most recent and most exciting work, and I was really curious to try out this training wheel metaphor. But of course, there's not only opportunities here, but also very significant risks. So I want to briefly summarize some of the key things we did to do this work responsibly. I think to anticipate and minimize any risks, I think one of the best things we did was to co-design these tools with various stakeholders from the get-go by working with, for instance, Mental Health America, with people with lived experience of mental health, with clinicians or other forms of mental health experts, patient advocates. Throughout all this work, we kind of follow and operationalize principle-based ethics frameworks that are well known, especially in the biomedical community, but much less so outside. Of course, everything you saw came with standard procedures around informed user consent and IRB review. And we use this idea of human AI collaboration not only to teach skills, but also to help filter inappropriate or potentially unsafe content, where we both kind of develop algorithms to do so, but we also empower users to tell us what's working and what's not working, and for instance, to flag feedback. And before deploying anything, we always do a kind of systematic collaborative stress testing process to really make sure that what we put out there is doing much more good than harm. Now, My lab here at the UW has worked on many other skills that I didn't have the time to bring into this talk, but collectively they really convinced me that when designed right, we can build these tools that teach people complex critical skills, and that scaffolding, deliberate practice, and feedback are always the key ingredients. For example, we taught peer supporters how to express empathy more effectively with the largest global peer support platform, TalkLive. With colleagues at UW Medicine, we're teaching clinicians patient-clinician communication after or kind of in particular challenging settings where there's medical harm. This is together with Andrew White, and this is actually a good time to say thanks to IMDS for sponsoring part of this research through a pilot grant. We've also tried to teach people critical thinking or fact-checking skills, and are currently exploring also how to give feedback on more creative tasks in other settings. But again, collectively, my takeaway really is that we can already today design human AI collaboration tools that teach us critical skills through scaffolding practice and feedback. The mental health world is one that I'm particularly passionate about, where I think making those tools accessible is dearly needed. In kind of for our own work, what that means is developing state-of-the-art natural language processing techniques and human AI interaction techniques to do so. And our work was able to then inform science through randomized trials, through large-scale field studies that demonstrate the effectiveness of these approaches, inform psychological theory, for instance, about how to do cognitive reframing in particularly effective ways. But I really see kind of opportunities to support individuals better through these type of tools to help us train a future mental health workforce that we so desperately need, and even more broadly, to help us guide how we perceive and communicate with others as well as ourselves. Finally, we're deeply grateful to all the amazing mental health organizations and counselors and peer supporters and advocates we get to work with. They use their time and energy, often even their suffering, to support others. And of course, we couldn't do this research without them. And finally, let me just show the amazing people that made this work possible that I only get to talk about here. If anybody's interested, here's the QR code if you want to try this public cognitive reframing tool. Let me highlight one of my PhD students, Ashish Sharma. He kind of built and led the work for the first project I showed you, and my PhD student, Inalin, did kind of led the work for the second IMU project that I showed you all. With that, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Althoff, for a very comprehensive, very detailed talk. I think it's always timely to talk about things like empathy and conflict resolution, and so on. Um, you're welcome to raise your hand if you have a question or put it in the chat. I will get us started. I had a number of questions. Maybe I'll start with the adolescent example, which I think is really demonstrative. I was talking recently to a friend about therapy, and I was kind of lamenting, like, oh, I don't think my therapist challenges me enough. And she said, well, I don't think my therapist validates me enough. And so there's kind of this disconnect that there's not one size fits all. People have different needs and preferences. And so for the adolescent example, I'm thinking, you know, is there a sort of in the second project you mentioned that there's kind of like a pre-training evaluation. Is there any sort of possibility of like a feedback loop where the AI portion of the tool adjusts to a given user's preferences and can pick up on some of those cues that you kind of formalize, like length of a reframe? Or is that too much to ask from a tool like this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think you pointed out a really like sensible scenario where different people have different preferences, and that's normal. That's always been this way. And especially kind of in this type of work, there's rarely kind of these one size fits all approaches. I think that's right, and that is currently challenging for many AI tools. What kind of the AI world really likes is, for instance, I don't know, like get these models to be really good at, say, high school math. Like that's something where there's objectively correct answers. We don't even need to work with, say, an end user and understand what their preferences are. There's an objectively correct answer. Those things tend to be much easier to evaluate. There's only one kind of correct answer, and that makes lots of things easier. Um, and that is what a lot of the work is about. So I do think this is a really great way for these models to improve going forward. Um, a little bit about what you're saying, I think, is happening implicitly, where, for instance, when we prompt these models, for instance, with my negative thought in a situation which this came up with, right? Like the model is already personalized to exactly my thought that it brought in. So it's definitely a spectrum in terms of what do we mean by this personalization? How far can that go? For instance, somebody that writes particularly long and maybe particular complex language as an input, that's much more likely to lead to a model output that's maybe also a bit more verbose and a bit more complex. So there's kind of certain mimicking going on that maybe captures some aspect of this type of personalization that you're mentioning. At the same time, clearly it worked better when we made some things a bit more explicit, for instance, in this teenager example. So broadly, I think this is a huge need for also this kind of foundational AI technology to do better and to kind of get past some very coarse assumptions about what is a good outcome, what's a bad outcome, who gets to decide that. I have my own, I know, rants and pet peeves about that, but to a large degree, this type of technology and industry currently relies on a third person, often in a third country, often not paid particularly well, often without kind of particular subject matter expertise. And we assume that that person can tell you, oh, this is a really great answer to Tim or not. And while this worked for some things, it really falls apart when things are more subjective, when preferences or needs change. Um, and I didn't go deep into, for instance, safety. I think different people have different needs, and that can kind of, especially in a mental health context, relates to safety as well. And I think making lots of assumptions behind the scenes and not really meeting people where they're at and their needs is a huge shortcoming of kind of the maybe current generation of these models. And I think one of the most exciting things for us to work on.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. Um, if there are any questions from the audience, feel free to chime in. But if not, I will ask my second question, which is I was curious just about a bit more of the technical details of how these models are trained, if they're pre-trained, or if they're maybe, focused in on specifically like CBT literature, if that's the goal. And my kind of like end goal with that question is you talked about some of the metrics that you're evaluating the efficacy of these tools with, which are some patient-centric ones like engagement or if someone feels better. Then there's also like skill development, which feels like a different area. But in my mind, a third one might be something like adherence to good CBT practices as they're laid out in, whatever guidelines that therapists are trained on. And so, yeah, part one is kind of like, how do you feel about what's going into these models as they're trained? And then B, is that a consideration? Is how good is the model doing compared to what CBT tells you to do, kind of, if that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yeah. Another great question with a few different layers. I think you're absolutely right. Like there's more patient-centered outcomes, some engagement outcomes where engagement in this digital mental health world is just notoriously difficult and bad. There's skill development outcomes where ideally we don't just create dependencies on these type of tools, but really teach somebody to use these skills when they need them to. And finally, properly operationalizing and implementing kind of evidence-based practice rather than the thousand shades of what other things it could be. And I think all of those are very central. Um, in many ways, I find that, for instance, this kind of adherence to good CBT practices to be often easier than some of the others. And maybe I slightly less emphasize them. But in many ways, like it is nevertheless a really critical part of developing this technology. It's also a critical part for computer scientists like me, not to reinvent the wheel, but to kind of collaborate with the people that already have kind of built up this expertise over often decades, if not centuries. Um, so for instance, the first tool on kind of cognitive reframing is powered by a kind of a large-ish database of 500 examples or so with kind of high quality reframes that we collected and curated with experts that really help encode um, kind of the principles of this practice and how this would look like. Or as I mentioned briefly, I had this, I think it was like 81 or 83% of the time, our feedback matched that of DBT therapists given the situation. So we very much try to encode that. And while it's non-trivial, it's actually one of the easier things, especially if you have identified the expertise or evidence-based practice and you can work with the right people. It often relates to relevant data collection and certain forms of evaluation. In many ways, where like even if you get that right, whether you can teach somebody that skill effectively or not, or what it takes to do so, or what design makes that better, is often less obvious, or how to do it in a really engaging way. I can't emphasize enough. When we do kind of traditional kind of research trials and we kind of massively incentivize people to participate in these trials, it's really complicated to get an accurate picture of kind of meaningful kind of engagement. And especially for this type of work where I think one really meaningful outcome is massively improving access. It really, like the value really needs to speak for itself. We can't pay people to kind of use this at scale. So if people are not willing to use it or the value isn't clear after even like 30 seconds, people won't use it. So I think I think it's important to emphasize some of these, say, patient-centric and or engagement outcomes as well, because they're a critical part of the equation that we often conveniently forget, especially in kind of more traditional research settings and how we recruit participants and so on. Or maybe the last thought I'll share, I don't know whether your question actually pointed at that, but there's a question, it's like, well, do you do better than a CBT therapist at that, or do you do exactly as well? And while those are absolutely meaningful questions, they're really not what we focus on the most. Just from perspective of the actual counterfactual of this kind of technology coming out is that most people currently have access to about nothing, and that is not likely to change in dramatic ways anytime soon. We would love to have many more options. So we really try in this work to focus on kind of the actual counterfactuals rather than, oh, we make CBT even better for the very few people that can work with a world-class CBT therapist, which is fantastic, but really doesn't scale. And we know we don't even have the capacity to train enough great CBT therapists anytime soon to meet the need in the world.
No, that's an important reframing for me as well, is that for the end user, maybe the comparison is it as good or better than a CBT expert, but rather is it better than nothing? And clearly, like this is a market improvement over, nothing. Like that's the reality, as you said, for probably most people.
And
Um,
I will add, we don't take that for granted. I absolutely think one could develop all these kind of tools and deploy this technology in ways that causes more harm than good. At the same time, I think when done right, I think there's a way to do this in ways where we can I know, create much better options and improve access for many people. Um,
And along those lines, I think, again, thinking just about like maybe the average end user who's interested in seeking some sort of solution that doesn't involve an expensive therapist or medical insurance, let's say, and this is an option for them. You included that comparison of Imbue versus GPT-4.
mhm.
And earlier in the talk, someone had posted a comment after you said, you told GPT that Tuesdays were your favorite day, and they posted the DeepSeek response.
Yeah.
And it seems like maybe that there's more nuance and consideration in this response rather than like a blanket agreement. And so this is kind of taking a step back, but for anyone who's doing this kind of work where one of the comparison points is like some model that's available, like GPT-4 or DeepSeek, I mean, how important or how feasible is it to stay on top of what's latest and say, okay, well, we outperformed GPT-3, but since we did that work, now GPT-4 is out, and maybe it provides more nuance and is closer to what we're doing. Like, is that how do you, I guess, tackle that where it seems like even as a, just observer of the field, every
Mhm.
week there's a new model that seems to outperform the past model in XYZ ways.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, another really good question, and well, like really a day-to-day challenge for people kind of I know interfacing with this work. There's tremendous hype. There's some real excitement. There's tremendous investment in this area. There's lots and lots of people with often strong commercial incentives, kind of really pushing this forward, and things can move quite fast. And even like as kind of academic researchers, there's I think long conversations to be had in terms of where our place can be or should be in all of that. I um, I I both find this a very valid concern, but I'm also really not too concerned by it. And part of the reason for that is that um, what a lot of the like, yes, there's models coming out, they all make wild claims. But the truth is, most of these are kind of they're less and less open, and it's less and less verifiable in terms of the claims that are being made. Um, so number one, I think no matter what, there's always a place for kind of open, reproducible, proper science. And then where these models, well, like what they compete over, is often not what we're most interested in. Often what these models compete over are kind of different data sets and benchmarks that come with loads of limitations, and they are kind of what's currently available and easy to evaluate on. Whereas much fewer things happen, for instance, in hey, we have this model that's kind of the super meaningful mental health support that takes into account kind of individual needs and um, I know safety considerations, etc. Where there's a lot of action is largely around the kind of the things that are already being done that are easier to evaluate. So I think there's actually um, lots of room for researchers also outside the few big tech companies that can still train these type of models to really innovate on what should these models be doing? How should we be evaluating these models? How do we, for instance, capture the kind of very challenging but important kind of individual level aspects of your first question? There's so many assumptions being made currently. I think while there's lots of action and certainly lots of perceived action, I think in terms of what should we be doing, and especially whenever what should we be doing is not aligned with kind of strong financial incentives for companies to go after them, there tends to be a lot less action. So I think it also really depends on the type of applications that are being done. We certainly have the problem that some of our papers, for instance, on empathy 3 years ago, use what we now view or the field views as archaic technology. At the same time, if everything kind of our work is doing is just kind of get some number up slightly more, there's other challenges with that as well. So I think if one focuses on like generalizable learning and kind of meaningful innovation and advancement in terms of what we should be doing, or focusing on the things that should be happening but somehow aren't happening yet, or other agents kind of incentives are not well aligned to really do that. I think there's lots and lots of that here as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Um, I will ask one more if no one else has any other questions, but feel free to chime in. Um, One thing that came to mind is these are, at least the way they're presented, text-based examples. Um, this is getting away from the technical, I guess, part of this talk, but I'm curious if over the course of doing these studies, there's any feedback about how important like voice or visual interaction was. Probably, I don't know, 10 years ago, the idea of like mass use of telehealth or like teletherapy maybe wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. Whereas now, like going to therapy on Zoom is, I think, pretty common for a lot of people. So that's already, one level of interaction kind of dialed back is that you don't have the in-person. So do you think that adding, if you could, those extra levels of interaction, like voice or whatever, some virtual component, add something, or this text-based tool is getting you the kind of outcomes that you that desire, like whether it's engagement or reframing, helpfulness, etc.
Yeah, yeah. Another great point. Admittedly, most of our work has not gone this direction. So most of all, I don't really know, but I see a lot of promise in some ways. But that is really um, kind of not based on kind of lots and lots of strong scientific data. For example, in this InView work, we simulate difficult conversation with kind of your desired conversation partner per your specifications. Well, like what level of fidelity of the simulation is optimal for certain outcomes? If they interrupted you and yelled at you, this might actually happen, or like this kind of asynchronous text, well, like fundamentally can't do that. So like that's somewhere where it's at least plausible that there might be some mileage to be gotten out of speech. And we're actually doing that in a recent project around kind of these clinician-patient conversations around medical harm, and actually also simulate the voice of the patient. It's also about like a user experience and kind of usability aspect where it's often more convenient to talk than to type. I'm also hopeful that the speech interface would lead to making this type of technology accessible to a broader population. Kind of not everybody is excited about, interacting with a chatbot. I have a hard time imagining my grandmother doing that, but if she could, call a hotline and talk to somebody, maybe she would. So I see, even if the speech doesn't add anything other than like a different input and output modality for convenience or to access different subpopulations, that seems very likely worthwhile to me. I have fewer examples where the like visual simulation is absolutely critical, and what level of fidelity there is really required. At the same time, I don't know, people use VR and AR for skills training too, and probably have thought about this more than we have. So ultimately, most of that is still in our future. And kind of what got a lot better, I think, are these language models and text-based things. And maybe one more comment I'll share is that things don't get necessarily better by adding voice. For example, some people use crisis hotlines in very unfortunate and complicated domestic violence situations. Texting-based platforms have actually been really helpful in that world because it provides a level of privacy where you can't be overheard, or for instance, like those crisis hotlines often have a deal with your phone provider that they will never be on your kind of itemized bill and these type of things. Or some people have social anxiety to such a strong degree that if this was a really high fidelity human simulation, it might actually be harder for them to use. So again, this is kind of, I think, meets your one size does not fit all type conversation, where I think there's likely significant value for many. At the same time, I also don't think it's kind of the only right way to do this.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a interesting point too. Probably maybe about cost as well. Like maybe, text-based is maybe cost effective, and the more fidelity you introduce,
Mhm.
that might be a consideration. We have one question from the audience from Gurjap. They ask, how would you say we ensure that patients do not develop an over-reliance on LLMs when receiving mental health support?
Yeah, I know. First of all, thank you for a question. I'm glad we are warming up and really appreciate you participating. I precisely wanted to use this training wheel metaphor because I don't think the solution is that a machine does all my thinking for me, or like it has little value to me if I'm really reliant on language models to do everything. Where I think most people are still regularly in situations where they need to do something on the spot. And we really need, like, there's some skills where they're just too valuable and too critical to outsource them to language models. So I think your question is really important, and that over reliance, especially in the world of mental health, kind of skill building is particularly problematic. Um, um, I kind of how do we ensure that? I think what I try to do with this talk and what we try to do with this work is just being very explicit that that's not the goal. And that we don't judge ourselves by getting lots of, or like we don't pat ourselves on the back by making lots of people reliant on this technology, but that instead we intentionally choose how we evaluate our kind of the technology that we're developing here, and by kind of focusing on actually, are you able to do this in your own life, also outside the tool? So I think just by kind of being explicit about this, by finding ways to more meaningfully evaluate it, because it's way easier to just say, it's like, I know people keep using it, they like it, they I know are willing to spend money of it, and they don't end the subscription. But like, what more success could you want? Of course, well, like financial incentives might guide you in that direction. But I think kind of so this is basically what we're doing. And some of the people left on the call, there's lots of unfortunate, though perhaps not surprising, negative things that have already happened in this space. For instance, some of you might have heard of I believe, teenager dying by suicide in kind of character AI interactions. But I would hardly characterize that as mental health support to, I don't sell over sexualized conversations to, for instance, teenagers. At the same time, right, I strongly suspect that some of these products were highly engaging for all the reasons that this might have been. At the same time, I think that, for instance, this engagement and reliance really is not kind of the only, it's certainly not ultimate way of kind of measuring meaningful success. So I think especially in terms of kind of dependency on machines in terms of your emotional needs, I'm actually particularly concerned about your question, even more so than I am for perhaps some of these skill building tools. But that's also something that's uh, perhaps kind of like more research and more regulation is needed, because as much as probably any kind of expert could have predicted that these negative outcomes are rather possible, and there were lots of warning signs, all of these things still happened. And sadly, I think at the scale of which people are using these tools, we don't even really understand how much harm is being done by so many people using tools for whatever health related aspects, for example. Um, and I think that's where we also have a responsibility in kind of doing these better. And I very much think that there are opportunities to serve people's actual needs much better. So right, like rather than maybe providing somebody a paid subscription to an AI friend that never disagrees with you too much, but like maybe we can help people, like help bring people together, equip them with the skills needed to navigate also challenging situations and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, what kind of guardrails might be helpful or necessary, given how past technologies were designed with not maybe the best interest of the end user in mind. Whereas, your approach seems to be very clearly with, skill building and patient-centered outcomes in mind, as opposed to like financials and subscription rates, etc. Um, if there are any other questions, speak up now. But if not, I will suggest we close for today. I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Althoff, again. Thank you so much for this Q&A session. I think it was really enlightening, and we got through a lot of additional material this way. And thank you to those of you who stuck around as well. I hope this was informative. We recorded this talk, and it will be up on either the IMDS website or YouTube at some point. So you're more than welcome to revisit and pass it on to others who might be interested. Thanks again, everyone, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Yeah, thanks so much.